In our increasingly divided country, what is the role for Christians in this moment? How do we become the peacemakers that Jesus called blessed? How do we heal rifts, wrestle with complicated topics in a world that prefers simple sound bites over thoughtful engagement? The Difficult Conversations podcast, hosted by NAE President Walter Kim, shares incredible stories of people who stepped into enemy territory to build bridges. You'll also hear from experts on why difficult conversations are so hard, how to have them, and why they matter for the kingdom of God. Listen now on your favorite podcast app.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm Walter Kim, your host. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. Much has been said about our increasingly polarized society. It seems we are becoming more entrenched in particular ideologies and less capable of seeing or understanding others. But are we as polarized as we think we are? Tim Dixon, co-founder of More in Common, joined today's conversation to discuss what we do have in common and how we can find more in common with others. Thanks for tuning in. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. The recent report from More in Common is full of so many intriguing insights, and I'm really looking forward to exploring it with you further.
Thanks, Walter. It's fantastic to join you, and I've been really enjoying the conversations you've been having in the last few months.
Oh, thanks. So let's just start by hearing a little bit more about you. Who are you? Where are you from? How did you get started in More in Common?
Sure. Well, professional journey. I have in the last 15 years been involved in doing a whole bunch of startups around not business startups, but more nonprofit around social issues, challenges. So a range of different things from things like modern day slavery, working on international hotspots like peace in Colombia, refugee crisis, the conflict in Syria, and other initiatives that are sort of about trying to find new ways to bring, whether it's technology or people, to try to solve difficult problems. And that work comes from really drawing on a few different parts of my professional background, which was grew up in Australia. I worked for two prime ministers as their speechwriter, and that's kind of a role that brings together a little bit the communications and policy making within government. I had a business in my 20s, a publishing business, which I ultimately sold to Pearson, but I learned from that all about, how to build a team and understand a market and all of those things, and really enjoyed that process. And I also worked as a lawyer for a few years with Baker & McKenzie, big global law firm based in Chicago. And from that, I guess I learned, working across a lot of different sectors. So I've had that kind of, the professional experience has been different disciplines and really enjoying the process of building new things. In terms of my spiritual journey, I grew up in a fairly non-religious household. I was exposed to religion, but didn't sort of grow up as a believer. I was quite skeptical of religious people. But I did, in my teenage years, come across some people who were very committed Jesus followers. I liked their values and ethics. I wasn't sort of keen on the religion so much, but they got me to read the Sermon on the Mount. And that was completely different to just being confronted with Jesus and Jesus' teaching. And that was what got me on a journey. I came to faith. And my life, I worked for some time with the Navigators organization, which, across the US works in military bases and campuses, really a kind of one-to-one discipleship model. That was enormously helpful. And I'm a product of quite a few different, because I've lived in different places. I first, when I came to faith, was in a Brethren church. Then I was in a Christian Missionary Alliance, spent many years in Pentecostal churches. My best friend is an Anglican evangelical priest in the oldest church in Australia. And my mentors have been a Wesleyan seminary president, and a Baptist pastor. So I'm kind of a bit of an amalgam of all of those influences which have shaped me. But I have a very strong vocational sense, which brings those professional and spiritual pathways together.
That's extraordinary. I mean, the journey that you've taken has twisted and turned in so many different ways, exposed you to so many different things. But I'm still intrigued by why, with all those experiences, you would gravitate toward the hotspots, toward the difficult issues, toward what seems to be intractable problems that would only lead to a disheartening sense of futility. And yet you come across as cheerful and eager to engage with these difficult problems. So give me a little bit of insight before we dive more into the more in common of
Yeah.
why would you, with all those range of personal and professional experiences, why would you want to tackle problems that seem so unsolvable?
I think one of the statements from Paul in his letters that very profoundly influenced me, firstly in the context of evangelism, but actually in context of life, was when he says, I didn't want to sow where somebody else had already sowed. So that sense of working on hard issues where I don't want to look if the solutions and people are doing good work, I don't know feel that I have a lot to add there. But if there's an issue where there's a gap, and there's a way that we might find a solution or move forward, and the existing models, organizations, whatever, aren't doing that. I think I'm very attracted to that. I'd rather try and fail than not try at all.
Hmm.
So I suppose it's kind of my makeup, and also I'm very I'm just a very curious person, so I have a very comparative lens. So more in common, we'll talk about in a moment. But one part of our work is we're across 6 countries. I grew up in one country, lived and worked in the United States and UK, Europe, last 15 years. So I have that lens. So just like I was a lawyer, I worked in politics, I have a sort of strategic communications lens, had my own business. Like it's that mix of not being fixed on this one solution. The old saying that if you've got a hammer in your hand, everything's a nail. But if you've had the privilege of working in different areas, different places, you have more maybe flexibility and agility to look for solutions. And I really enjoyed that, and I really enjoy building teams around that, the kind of relational piece of uh, building a team identity where you say, okay, we're working together to solve this problem. And more in common, fantastic 55 people we've got of all kinds of backgrounds. It's not an exclusively faith-based organization. There's many people who are of Christian faith and other faiths as well, but many people who aren't. But we're working on the really big, challenging issue of division and polarization, and it's not a problem that's going to be solved quickly. But we are, the journey of trying to find where opportunities where you can change those dynamics, break through, where you can learn from one place, take to another place. That's part of the thrill of doing this work.
Hmm. So the more in common, I get the part where you're seeking to address polarization by saying we have more in common by finding common ground. But it's not just about providing statistical analysis or a diagnosis. I mean, you're actually looking to find ways to help us discover more in common. So describe that. I mean, it's not quite a research institution, think tank place. It's not just an activist place. How do you blend all those pieces together?
Well, so our journey, the More in Common, was started because there was kind of a long-term reflection that there's things changing in established democracies that are profoundly putting democracy at risk, but just both in terms of the extreme risk of violence when relationships break down within societies, but also just the practical thing of societies that become polarized don't solve problems anymore. They become more stuck, more kind of gridlocked, as you can see in the political process in the US in recent years. They become really unproductive. People you get the anguish and anxiety, the mental health problems, the family relationships that are pulled apart, friends and so forth. So all of that was happening, and then a friend of mine who was a politician in the United Kingdom, Jo Cox, had only been in Parliament for a year. She was a very talented young political figure, and she was murdered her district in Yorkshire, and she was the kind of politician I was closest to. I was with her husband, in fact, when he got called that she'd been attacked. And that was, it was incredibly tragic. She had two young kids. It was incredibly jarring because, just the personal loss. But it was also a catalyst for me to think, okay, this is not just something I'm going to start an organization, start something, and then push it out and move on to my next thing. I really want to focus on this because I think it's come very close to me personally, but I also think its effect on our societies is very profound. So that's the story about how we came together. We didn't have a fixed idea of this is the model of what we're going to do, but we did find that one of the things that's adding to our divisions and getting us stuck in polarization is that we imagine that what we hear about division, that we're sort of a 50-50 country, that, there's irreconcilable differences, we imagine that's true. And when we did the research, we realized like what's partly happening here is an effect of social media, what's happening in our information environment, where small numbers of quite, extreme voices are constantly being elevated, and we're accelerating into conflict when in fact it's totally avoidable. And so a part of our work has been to really get down to have a lens of people and what are people thinking, what's their experience, and is this really true? And it's, a lot of our insights are around how we're really not as divided as we think, but we're constantly being fed this story by people who you had Amanda Ripley a little while ago on the podcast, and she talks about the conflict entrepreneurs. So insights is one thing, but we're very much committed to making those real, applying them. So from there, we work in partnership closely with lots of organizations and organizational leaders to help them use those insights to defuse the polarization. And in addition to the partnerships, we're working across all our countries in trying to broaden the ecosystem of leaders and institutions who can see themselves as part of the solution. One of the reasons why polarization succeeds is people lose hope. They become convinced we're stuck on this kind of treadmill, we can't get off it, there's a sense of fatigue. And that's part of the conflict entrepreneurs want to rob us of that sense of hope and possibility. So we work to encourage, sort of develop the leadership skills involved in changing the dynamics of polarization. So it's insights, it's partnerships, it's helping to build a bigger ecosystem. And part of that is like, it's not all about politicians, like a lot of the solutions are not about politics. They're just about ordinary people and how we live our lives in ways that connect better with people who are, on the other side, so to speak, who are different from us. And that's where the conversations you've been having with the Difficult Conversations series, I think, have been fantastic in demonstrating that there's lots of solutions that apply at a very localized level to these dynamics.
Mm. We'll get to a bit of the Difficult Conversations podcast and some of the findings that we've had just in the course of the discussion, how it intersects with your own work. But I want to explore a bit of your work before we get there. And the report that I alluded to earlier is called Promising Revelations, Undoing False Impressions of America's Faithful. All right, that is just so intriguing. You're going to have to unpack that for us. What are the false impressions, and then why do they need to be undone? So let's just begin with what are these misconceptions?
Yeah, well, so the three big misperceptions that we focus on in this report are the idea that faith is all about politics, that religion is becoming irrelevant, and that religious people are fundamentally intolerant. And it's a big study, 6,000 people surveyed, 300 people, leaders and people were involved in focus groups, one-on-one conversations, a year-long study. So there's a deep base of data to it. It's nationally representative. And we look at evangelicals as well as mainline Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Latter-day Saints, Mormons. So it also allows us to have a bit of a comparative lens as well on different faiths. I mean, I think for this conversation, I'll mostly focus on the evangelicals, but there's a lot in there. So we were looking at those three propositions, and if I just could quickly play those out, the idea that we were looking at is what we call perception gaps, which is that polarization gets worse because one group has inaccurate and extreme opinions about or perceptions of the beliefs of the other side. So what you do is you ask people, what do you think evangelicals believe? And you ask evangelicals what they believe, and then you say, well, is there a difference? And what you find in where there are groups that are polarized and the dynamics of polarization at play, you find big gaps. So one story that you find constantly, the mention of evangelicals in the media in America, it's almost entirely about politics. But politics actually plays a much smaller role in the life of most American evangelicals than we imagine. So we ask, give you a couple of statistics. We ask the question, what's most important to you? What in your life about your identity? And so we ask, is it your faith, family, work, gender, or your politics, your partisan identity? We asked Americans, what do you think is most important to evangelicals? Well, 41% said, it'll be politics. We asked evangelicals, the answer was 4%. So the view that's held by the broader American public, 10 times as many evangelicals are all about politics than the reality. And interestingly, evangelicals' own view of their own community is almost as distorted as the rest of the country too. So it's not as if we even know ourselves. We also asked the question, obviously evangelicals, white evangelicals are very connected to an image of being Republican voters. So we asked the question, do you agree that to be a good Christian, you need to vote Republican? Only 1 in 5 evangelicals agrees with that, but in the wider public and among Americans, 3 in 5 think that that's shared belief. And actually, if you ask evangelicals, 2 in 5 think, oh yeah, 2 in 5, evangelicals will believe that. So there is these are the perception gaps. Why does that matter? Because what we've found is that there is a direct linear relationship. The larger your perception gap, that is, the more you're inaccurate about evangelicals, the more you dislike them. So we call this collateral contempt. The perception of evangelical Christians in America today is profoundly shaped by misperceptions about politics, and it directly relates to a more hostile attitude or a more fearful attitude. And it's significant in that if you look at, Gen Z evangelicals are evenly divided between Democrat, Republican, and independents today. So the political complexion of evangelicals is changing, but there's this sort of fixed idea that, okay, they're all sort of rabid Christian nationalists. So that was one piece. It's just like, and it's the centrality of politics to their lives. It's just not the case. We ask people, why do you turn to your faith? On average, among faithful Americans, people with a faith, about half of them say it's they put their relationship with God first. But among evangelicals, 82%, it's higher than any other group. So I actually think that the real life of most evangelicals is a lot less extreme and politicized than what the perception, both evangelicals and the wider public is. Just on the other two findings quickly, on the question of the relevance of religion, there's an assumption that religion is in kind of terminal decline, becoming increasingly irrelevant, especially to Gen Z. Again, the numbers just don't hold that up. 73% of Americans say their faith is important to their identity. And among Gen Z, it's 66%. It's lower, but it's not dramatically lower. There's such a focus on essentially a 10-point shift. Whereas what you should be focusing is on 2/3 are still saying that faith is important to their identity among Gen Z. And in fact, in terms of attending church or religious services, we found 35% of Gen Z said they had attended something in recent weeks, and that compares to actually a lower number among other groups, generational groups, other than the silent generation. It's more than millennials. It's more than Gen X. So it's just a different story. It's not to say that like there's a revival abroad. It's just to say we're exaggerating the change. And thirdly, on the issue of tolerance, there is a sort of caricature in people's mindsets that, if you're Jewish, you're like a militant Zionist. If you're Muslim, then you're a kind of, a Gaza activist. If you're an evangelical, you're a white nationalist. And again, just not true. Around 4 in 5 of all of those groups say America should be a place where everybody should be able to belong and feel welcome and feel a part of the country, no matter what faith background they have. Very high levels of interest in meeting people from different faiths as well. It's not to say that there aren't those extremes, and there's certainly more of it and more of that antagonism and conflict. But again, I think our problem is that the conflict is constantly exaggerated because social media algorithms are, exaggerating a small number of people with more extreme views, and our legacy media or our old established media kind of plays the same game, catch up, and we just don't get the more normal and healthier picture of what's happening in everyday lives, that we should be getting.
Tim, you've given us so much intriguing information, as I mentioned earlier. And I want to, for our listeners' benefit, note that we will add a link to this report in our show notes for people to be able to digest this really critical information. You've given us a lot of confounding information, like counterintuitive or at least counter-experiential to what we believe to be the case. How do people receive that? I mean, in the face of giving information of, oh, things are not what you think they are, despite the algorithms and the force of social media and traditional media, do people find this information and receive it with a sigh of relief of like, oh, yes, finally, something that affirms what either I thought to be true or hope to be true? Or do people say, yeah, it's not true because I am overwhelmed by this narrative in the media? Like, how are people receiving information that is counter to the story that they've been given?
I think there's a mix. When we first published a report, now it's 6 years ago, called Hidden Tribes, which maps out the values and psychology of the American population. We coined the term exhausted majority, and we said like 2/3 of this country, actually want more compromise, feel unrepresented by all of this conflict, and feel just fatigued by the level of division, and don't feel that they have to win all the time and get their own way. And that idea of the exhausted majority really took off, and it's kind of become part of the day-to-day parlance of, there's been many politicians of both sides who've stood up, run for office and who've said, I'm the candidate for the exhausted majority. And I think that's one of the positive things that I've heard in lots of different places was how, because there's a real scholarship behind that, there was a lot of work, it's a kind of credible evidence base. We work with a lot of social psychology professors to kind of build that study. That people were inspired and have been inspired from just understanding the gap between what they're hearing and the reality. And so, people have started things. We've started organizations, initiatives. It's a very exciting part of the work that we do, is just hearing the way that when you correct this misunderstanding and, tell the real story, people begin to notice, oh, there's more positive things around than what I thought. And so that's great. On the other side, if you're directly involved in a conflict, one thing that we've been doing with our work is trying to understand, okay, there might be the other side, so to speak, might be less extreme than you imagine. But how do I convince you of that if you feel threatened by them? And that's a different exercise, convincing people. So we've actually done work on that, because if you just give people the facts, they'll say, well, where does this come from? I don't believe it. I see these people going crazy on social media all the time. And so we've been working on trying to understand, how do you shift those perceptions if someone feels that I really believe the other side is dangerous and threatening. And what we've learned is that facts are one thing, have a certain amount of people are convinced by them. Hearing, engaging with someone from the other side, yeah, that has some effect. It's more effective than just hearing a fact. But what's most important is someone from your own tribe, from your own group, validating, yeah, the other side, they're not as extreme as you think. So just saying, I've formed a friendship, for example, with someone who's got very different beliefs from me. But look, this is what I've learned about them. That's the most persuasive. And so that's a part of, where we're doing work, is to find the experts talk about these people as in-group moderates, the people who belong to a tribe, who are trusted within that group, but who can be moderating voices within it. And they're critical to changing these dynamics.
Yeah, this notion of conflict entrepreneurs that you've alluded to, you mentioned our difficult conversations podcast at the NAE, and Amanda Ripley is kind of coining this and promoting this term conflict entrepreneur to describe those on the edges. Another person, and we get that. Another person, Sheila Heen, on the Difficult Conversations podcast, talked about affective polarization. In other words, the polarization that doesn't come from the conflict entrepreneurs directly, but they are the halo effect of the conflict entrepreneurs. They're the kind of producing feelings that, wow, maybe I should be polarized too. It seems to me very powerful that if you give a counterexample to the conflict entrepreneur, this in-group moderate, that you give a sliver of hope that, oh, I actually don't have to be affectively polarized. I don't have to be in this whole halo effect. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I think the affective polarization is all about being defined by your opposition to the other side, and this is happening in our politics a lot. People become more defined by what they're against rather than what they're for. I think what we've lost, or what we have less of now than we once had, was if somebody came along and told you a bad story about people from some other group, you would say, well, I hear that, but on the other hand, I know someone who's that, and that's not what they're like. Now, I would say that there is a difference on the issue of racial separation, segregation between white and black Americans that I think is a little different to many of the other dynamics, because historically, genuinely, there hasn't been that connection and it's still the case that huge numbers of white black Americans are not friends with people from the different group. But broadly, for many of those, and particularly around politics, which is the deepest division that drives the most hatred in our current moment. You used to have those connections, but now, because we're being sorted in so many different ways, in our local communities, in our echo chambers, even in our churches, if you don't have those relationships, those cross-cutting relationships with people with different beliefs, you're much more likely to buy into that. So that's why building those relationships that are across the lines of difference are really important. Modeling how those relationships exist is really important, because people are seeing less of that, experiencing less of that, and that's what makes them much more vulnerable to that us versus them story.
Yeah, Tim, in the Difficult Conversations series, which we'll add a link to that as well in our show notes. We've been talking with churches, communities, families on the experience of being divided, but also talking about how Christians can be peacemakers, the kind of peacemakers that Jesus calls blessed. From your perspective, from your research, from your personal experience, what role do you believe the church has and followers of Jesus have in bringing healing to the division and polarization we see?
I think it's such a critical role. I mean, partly because churches have reach into the community that just, is rare, very unusual, and it really isn't equaled by any other institution in society. I also think, thinking a little bit more theologically, I think God's people have always had a prophetic role to speak to whatever the dysfunctions of their society were. The prophets often spoke about the profound inequality the society they're in. And you think of, the great social reformers in the more recent centuries who built the hospitals, the universities, the social institutions. Evangelicals have had such a significant role in that. So I think in the same way, there is a prophetic role now that is, part of how we should be. We as Christians, as evangelicals, should be thinking about, what difference can we make? And I think it's kind of, there's two elements to it. And one part is just living it out, like living out the story of the multi-ethnic church. I thought that the conversations you had with Caleb Campbell and Derwent Gray and the experiences of Mark Damas was another, like those experiences of churches that are demonstrating in real life the capacity for people from different backgrounds to be one, to be unified together. This is what Jesus prayed, John 17, that they may be one. It's such a critical part of what can be distinctive about churches in a divided society. But, the tragedy right now is that, as we discuss in the report, churches are perceived as accelerants to the country's division rather than as off-ramps to the division. So I do think that we need imagination to a vision for something that's different. We need to live that out. But also, we can draw a lot if we turned off our social media feeds and kind of allowed that to form us less and allowed the biblical story to inform us more. Then, think of Jesus' time. Jesus' disciples, Jesus lived in a time that was profoundly polarized. And think of the extraordinary thing that, the division in that time among Jews was about how do you respond to the Roman occupation. And you had Simon the Zealot, who was one of his disciples. The Zealots wanted violent overthrow. They believed in violent revolution. They wanted Jesus to be that revolutionary leader. You had Matthew, the tax collector, who was like a kind of political lobbyist of today, I guess. Somebody who was profiting out of, totally sold out to the system, would be perceived as being treasonous, totally betrayed his country. And yet, and that's the story, the disciples, Jesus' followers, were incongruous in the way that they brought together opposing sides. But their identity, once they followed Jesus, was, became transcended those differences. So I just think there's an opportunity to be that. There's a set of leadership skills that we think a lot of in More in Common's work about how you transcend division. Part of it's about identifying these false binaries, the way that issues become falsely polarized, and avoiding that, building on common ground. It's the capacity, like there are just aspects of how you lead any organization, whether it's a faith community or whether it's in the wider community, that I think we now as leaders need to acquire those skills, because the dynamics of how you lead are just different in the age we're in. And I constantly in my work come across people who have just like been smacked in the face by the politicization of something that they thought was completely neutral. I mean, you had the conversation in the Difficult Conversation series around COVID. Why was that suddenly so divisive? And I think that's our challenge now, is that any issue can be politicized and weaponized because, we've got this sort of polarization industrial complex that's driving it. And so it's really hard to avoid actually in any leadership role. So helping people to be aware of those dynamics. I think, the NAE obviously has a really important role in that for pastors. But I think it's not just being reactive, it's also kind of having a larger vision that we want to move towards. And I think faith communities are rare in the landscape of America today in their capacity to bring people together across the lines of difference and to project that kind of vision. And I think that's the potential that we need to lay hold of instead of purely being in a reactive mode.
I want to go back to this concept of the in-group moderate being so critical. I want to ask a couple of questions related to that, given the critical role that in-group moderate has. What prevents an in-group moderate person from taking a role of leadership? In other words, what are the things that are perhaps chaining that person and preventing that person from really stepping into this moment and providing the kind of leadership that you're describing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think one thing that we've learned in our the typology that we build this sort of model of, it's really understanding the different dispositions towards society that people have, like what are their starting points. One group that traditionally has been most civically active, most sort of involved in community in our typology, called the moderates, they've really withdrawn from public engagement because they really dislike conflict. And they see that any public role, you get exposed to attacks, criticism. You've discussed it in some of the Difficult Conversations series. that they are really sensitive to those dynamics. And it concerns me because I see, particularly women, um, in public leadership roles being, you know, very viciously attacked online, especially, but not only. And so that's one aspect is some of the people with the strongest capacity to be those in-group moderates are most averse to conflict, and roles that just in the past, were not seen as conflictual, now are. So I think that's a part of it. I also think that the dynamics that we are confronting, because people are in media environments where extreme things are being sort of thrown up all the time, they can believe that that is the reality, and so they lose hope. And so one part of the work that More in Common has been doing is just trying to understand best how do people recover a sense of possibility and a sense of hope that is evidence-based. It's not just kind of, nice thoughts, but it's also really understanding what is that pathway to believe that there's a way out. I mean, part of the trick of the conflict entrepreneurs is to tell you that you have no agency, that you're powerless, that these forces are stronger. That, this is, I mean, the foreign influence, which is, another dimension of this. It's kind of what foreign interference has always tried to do to weaken democracies, is rob people of any sense of agency. So it's important for us to think about how people who are disengaging, and who are more vulnerable to buy into us versus them, they can recover some sense of that. And there's elements there where it's about feeling more respected. It's about having more of a sense of belonging. It's a sense of affirmation, something that you can be proud of, whether it's a group you're part of, a local community, or it's your sense of national identity. It's reducing people's sense of threat. And it's strengthening people's trust in each other, trust in institutions. All of those things are under attack. People feeling disrespected, people feeling fearful, people feeling no sense of belonging, people feeling distrustful. And so countering those is really important because, it's also people who are, ordinarily kind of less involved, who are really important in changing these dynamics, because as people disengage, they become more likely to buy into the us versus them stories that are being, parlayed around in our sort of social media environment. And so we need to think about how we reduce that vulnerability.
Mm. When you think about the in-group moderate, and this is both a final question about the in-group moderate, but also an invitation to give us a final word of encouragement. It is with the in-group moderate, the hope that's required, the fortitude, the courage that's required, the ability to endure the slings and arrows of critiques often from your own tribe, much less the conflict entrepreneur. What is a final word of hope that you would give to us that this is all worthwhile, especially as followers of Jesus?
Well, I think we we are so stuck in the negativity and the story of conflict and division that we miss the fact that even quite small moments of connection can change these dynamics. So just to give you one example, we have a partnership with the media organization StoryCorps. StoryCorps is working to bring people from across divides together for just a conversation, 50-minute conversation, complete strangers. They've found that's very positive, and it's working extremely well. StoryCorps has been around for 20 years and has done amazing work. But what the More in Common role is to find out when people hear a snippet of that conversation, just a couple of minutes of that conversation, how do they react? And the surprising thing is how even exposure to just a couple of conversations like that for a couple of minutes shifts people's willingness, interest, enthusiasm to have a conversation like that by more than 50% increase. We just did a survey a little while after a few days after the election, and we found that 66% of Americans say they want to connect with somebody who voted differently from them. So it's not like, and only less than 10% of people say they don't want to. So there's an appetite to, and when people hear some of that just healthy conversation, people being humorous, relaxed, friendly, it changes their disposition. They think, oh, maybe there's something different to, the kind of the dystopia that I'm hearing around me all the time. So I just think we can't underestimate the power of even quite small exposure, quite small steps, because, for many people, they're just not seeing that positive side or hearing the positives. And it's not to be Pollyannaish. I mean, there are profound differences, and part of, we need to learn how to manage our differences and be able to, have the difficult conversations, as your series said. But I do think the small steps matter, and it all starts with the small steps. You don't have to take on the whole problem of a deeply polarized society, but you can start. You can start in your own church community, because right now, and this is what the Promising Revelations report discusses. Right now, a lot of this polarization is actually being experienced within the church, within churches, within faith groups. And that's got to be addressed as a starting point before the potential prophetic role, transformative role that the church can be playing in a time of division, before that can be realized. So I think that's where, the really positive stories that you've been sharing about churches have been working through these hard issues are inspirational and so important. And it'd be fantastic to, see how that this kind of work can develop. Because I do think there's a potential for a real movement across the country that can change these dynamics. And it always starts small, always starts with these, at the little local level. It's a really interesting finding, just my last point, but we asked all across the country, how does your local community compare with the rest of the country? Every single part of America, every local community, the majority of people say, oh, we're better than the rest of the country. The rest of the country is much more divided. Well, not every kid can be above that average, and not every community can be better than the rest. Maybe the reality is that we're buying into a story of the whole country being more divided than what it really is. And maybe, changing those dynamics can start locally.
It makes me think of Jesus' teaching. Faith as small as a mustard seed
Yeah.
can really move mountains.
Yeah.
Our guest on today's conversation has been Tim Dixon. I'm Walter Kim, and on behalf of us all, thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Walter.